Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, member Louis Bouget shares her path from an investment banking analyst at a bulge bracket bank to getting her JD MBA. Learn the common blind spot she had when choosing what bank to join out of undergrad, as well as why she chose Goldman to continue her banking career after her graduate degree. Also, learn how she managed to pivot to private equity and a shocking comment made by a partner during final round interviews. Enjoy. All right, Louis Bouget, thanks for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of the podcast world, and so it's really exciting to be a part of one.
Cool. So it'd be awesome if you could give the listeners a short summary of your background.
Yeah. So after I graduated from college, I started as an analyst at a bank, both bracket firm, worked for 2 years, and then went back to grad school and did a JD MBA program. After grad school, transitioned back to banking, but at a different firm at Goldman, and then transitioned into private equity shortly after my 2 years as an associate.
Awesome. So that's pretty rare. So you went banking 2 years, so undergrad, banking 2 years, JD MBA, then banking again as an associate at Goldman, and then you went PE. So I think everyone that's listened to the podcast, anyone that's been on WSO knows that it's extremely difficult to transition to private equity unless you have pre-MBA private equity experience. So what was the thought process? Were you always set like gung-ho on private equity when you went to get your MBA, or was it something that you kind of later discovered you wanted?
I wasn't. I think I took a very scholastic approach to my career. So in transitioning from my analyst years into the JD MBA program, I was looking for a program that offered, from the legal perspective, sort of like a space and teaching to me of like the basic understandings of law. So in the future, if I were to do transactions, then I'd be able to holistically understand both the legal and the business considerations. But at the same time, there's also this very scholastic side of me that's like, okay, I get to go to one of the greatest law schools. And then essentially what law school is you're learning about history through a legal lens. And I thought that'd be really fun. So went back for 3 years. And then the transition back into banking afterwards, I didn't really consider PE at that point. I went to a school that wasn't really strong with PE recruiting, more so on the mutual fund side. And after a couple rounds of interviews there, I realized that's not something that I was that interested in. And when the Goldman opportunity came along, it was also very different from my analyst experience. One, the bank had M&A embedded into the industry groups. The bank was strong in all of the products across the board. So previously I was at a bank that was only more so stronger on the lending side, but now
let's go back to that. Let's go back to your undergrad days. So thanks for that little spiel in terms of, private equity wasn't on the horizon. It wasn't something where you were like, I eventually want to go do that. It kind of eventually came.
I was definitely open to it, but I definitely wasn't the type of person that's like, okay, banking is a means and an end, and I would transition out in a couple of years.
Okay, fair. So let's go back to undergrad days, because I think just to go sequentially, it'll help the listeners follow along. Let's talk about when did you think, hey, I want to go finance? Or was this something like by freshman year you knew I'm going to start recruiting right away for investment banking? Or was this something where you kind of came into it late?
To be honest, back when I went to school, it was a lot less intense, so you didn't have to make that commitment that early on. So I was able to explore marketing, accounting, finance, and I definitely liked finance the most. I thought it was the most challenging field, and that's sort of what my personality caters to. I like that it's fast paced. I like both the interpersonal and the technical aspect of the job, and how at least from the banking perspective, it sort of yields and looks for a person that's well-rounded. And that's how I thought of myself at the time.
Was it recruiting tough out of your school? I mean, you went to a pretty good school that has pretty good connections into Wall Street. So did you feel like it was competitive? Did you feel like were your grades really high, so it wasn't that hard to get interviews, or what was your experience like?
I think it was competitive within the school, but because the school is very well reputed and has connections to the bank, it was a very seamless process. I think the banks come on to campus for maybe 2 to 3 weeks, and you meet everyone across the banks, do your interviews, and then you're pretty much done there from then on.
And was it anything in terms of like, I guess, unexpected during those interview processes that like you wish you had prepped more for?
To be honest, it was a long time ago, but not anything striking to my memory.
Okay. And then when you actually like started the process, were you just doing, it sounds like it was all on campus, right? Kind of set up
Yeah,
for you.
that's right.
Do you remember how many kind of resume drops you did and how many interviews you got?
I probably I probably applied to them all across the board.
Mhm. So like 20,
Probably got
30?
yeah, exactly, something maybe in the teens, and then probably got interviews all across the board,
Oh, you
and
did.
then
Okay.
I filtered from like then there's like the first rounds and then the second rounds, and so it just sort of narrowed down. I think I ended up with 3 offers, and then chose the one that I went
That's
with.
really impressive. That's really impressive. I think that's a lot of people come out and, getting one offer is kind of a dream. So getting three is awesome. So you went from about 15 resume drops. Correct me if I'm wrong. First round, you got first round interviews at almost all of them.
Yep. I think at that time it was GPA based only, and my GPA was high enough to where I got for first rounds everywhere.
Got it. And so did you end up doing first rounds everywhere?
I don't entirely remember. If
Or
not everywhere, probably most
like
of the
10 of
places.
them? Like 10 of
Yep,
them or something?
exactly.
Okay. And so then you did first rounds at around, let's say 10 places. You got second rounds or final rounds at 4, 5 places?
I think so. Yep,
Okay.
I think
And
so.
then 3 offers. Okay. So that's really impressive. And so then when you were going through this process, did you find that you had to know a lot of technical questions, or did you feel like where you set yourself apart was like behavioral? How did you feel like why do you feel like you got so many offers besides the high GPA and coming from a good school?
I think at that point the technicals are very rote. It's very much like if you read the Mergers and Inquisitions book, that was more than enough.
Yeah.
And then the behaviors at that point were also pretty simple because at that point you haven't had that much work experience, so there's only so much that you can say. But I think just coming from a good school and having the GPA really helped.
Yeah, no, for sure. So you're basically going through this, you get the 3 offers. What makes you decide on the bank that you did? So I know
Um,
you don't have to say what it is, what bank it is, but it was a bulge bracket, large bank. Um, was it because the other ones were smaller? Was it something about the firm itself?
yeah, it was definitely the other ones were smaller, a little less well reputed. I definitely had a lesser of an understanding of the differences between the banks than I do now.
Mhm.
So it was just thinking at a bulge bracket, you could get a wide variety of experience.
And so when you started those analyst years, what was the biggest surprise when you first started?
Huh.
Because you did a summer analyst stint there, I assume.
Yeah.
And so that process, was there anything when you went through that internship process, was it more like the honeymoon phase where they're like, not working you too hard, or were you working like 80+ hour weeks? What was it like that?
It was probably somewhere in between. It wasn't something super terrible. I don't think my analyst years were that bad as well. I think in retrospect, one of the things is I didn't realize that you like the bank that you went to, they're strongest at one thing, and you'll end up doing that one thing. So at 22, you don't take that into consideration, and so the second time I really evaluated across the banks and across the different platforms what was different, what was strong, what was weak about each one, and then deciding to make the choice
Where
that
do you
time around.
feel like, so you mean specifically like certain groups are really strong or certain products are really
Yeah,
strong, product
the
groups?
products, the groups, everything, because it's like the whole job itself is very episodic, so it sort of depends on like where the peaks of the waves are, and you definitely want to be at the group that's strongest in a particular thing that particular bank does, because that's where you'll see the bulk of the deal flow.
Would you say, given what you know now, would you have taken one of the smaller bank offers if it was a stronger group, or would you have still gone bulge bracket? Like,
Yeah, in retrospect, I would have taken another opportunity. If
hmm.
I was going to end up in PE anyways, I think maybe one of the other opportunities may have helped me realize my career path.
Do
In
you mind
like,
sharing what that bank was since you didn't go? Do you mind?
I prefer not to say anything.
Okay. So you're basically you had an offer at a smaller bank, but you felt like it was a product group or like, maybe M&A or something like that would have given you kind of a wider breadth versus going into a bulge bracket where the training I assume was very good. But the day-to-day work was a little bit more narrow and
Yeah,
focused
yeah,
on this
exactly.
one area. Okay, that's fair. And so did you feel like, so group strength matters, I agree 100%. And where you're specifically where the bank specifically focuses and the number of deals they do matters. So were you doing a lot of pitches during your 2 years, or did you feel like you got enough live deal experience?
I did a lot of pitches, and then in the deal work that I did, it was a lot of more capital markets activities than M&A,
Mhm.
and that's sort of what I mean, because if you do want to transition to PE, it's crucial to have that M&A experience, have
Yeah.
understanding of the process, have understanding of like what are the key issues, and that is sort of the experience that I wanted but didn't get in my first 2 years.
So when did you realize that's what you wanted?
Probably a year in.
And why? Like why? Like you were just like, well, that's more interesting, or what was about M&A that kind of attracted you versus what you were doing? Or you just felt like
Um,
you had done enough of the capital markets
well,
work?
so like on paper, I think the jobs are very similar, but in actuality, if you think about the significance, it's very different. Through M&A, you get to understand the businesses more, you get to understand the operations more. Whereas the capital markets activity, you don't really need to understand what a business does to be able to issue a bond.
Got it. Well, I mean, in cap markets, so tell me the type of stuff you were doing. Weren't you looking at like, I guess you're looking more at like the credit worthiness of them and stuff like that and just cash flows?
Yeah, exactly. And then when you're looking at the financial profile of the company, you're looking at the revenue, the EBITDA, you're not really thinking about, okay, what's contributing to it? Why is there a huge jump? Are they actually onboarding clients correctly? Are they firing customers that are not good for the company? There's just a lot of like the business intuition that you don't get in a role that's purely focused away from M&A.
Whereas M&A, you're saying they would do kind of more detailed revenue build-ups, more analysis of the actual operations. Okay.
Yep, yep, exactly.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Okay, so that's fair. So you're kind of going through your 2 years. At the end of year one, you're thinking, it'd be great if I could get some M&A experience. Did you try to transition internally?
I didn't then. I'd also always wanted to go to grad school. I went to a very sort of finance focused undergrad. And so for me, going back, getting the JD MBA is sort of stepping back, going into the humanities and sort of like learning something different. And in life, it's sort of like the last chance that I get to do something like that. So I treasure that experience. And then if you, with law schools, a lot of students go straight through from undergrad. So having been 2 years out, I was already on the older side. So I had to control for both time and experience. So I decided to go back to grad school first.
Was there, so you felt a little bit of a rush to get the JD because people go straight from undergrad?
Yeah, I think you're more disadvantaged with admissions,
Hmm.
with admissions, the older you get.
I didn't realize that existed. Is
Yeah,
that like a true thing? Like that's a known thing? Like
yeah.
age
So what
discrimination?
I mean,
Well,
it's not that, right? It's like they're trying to build a cohesive class, and it's the same with all the analysts and the associate classes. They don't usually want someone who's too old for the role, because then you're not going to integrate as well. You're not going to have that sort of experience where you have both the network and the learning aspect. And so there's just a lot of considerations from their end as well.
got it. So like your window was closing for the JD. You always wanted, what made you attracted to the JD MBA?
I think it's also so first when I was an analyst, I did look at a couple of distressed companies, and I just thought a lot the experience was a lot more bespoke. The analysis was a lot more a lot more bespoke and very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what the work that we had done brought in the legal teams and having to understand the credit docs and having to understand the protections, the covenants, and that appealed to me. And then also, as I said in the beginning, like I've always wanted to go to law school. I think it's a beautiful part of society, and you get to learn about what transpired in history, but through a very specific lens that I think is very interesting.
That is interesting. I mean, did you ever consider going into restructuring? Because I worked in restructuring for a couple of years at Rothschild. So it's funny you bring up the legal distressed side. So I immediately.
No, I definitely have. I think with my associate recruiting process, the two firms that I got really far with was one, a restructuring firm, and then two, Goldman. And I ended up going with Goldman. But had I gone down the other route, I think my career would be very different than now.
Do you feel like you might have stayed in banking longer? Because you went post JD MBA, you went Goldman, and you did that for a few years, correct?
Yes, for 2 years.
So did you feel like the search out and we'll get to the private equity recruiting process, coming from a post MBA with no pre MBA experience, but did you feel like if you had gone restructuring, you might have stayed there? Or do you feel like there was always that part of you like that was drawing you to the buy side to be an investor?
I I don't actually know. I didn't go into banking as an associate the second time to get into PE either. And I think restructuring is probably a totally different experience than pure M&A or the other non-restructuring banking roles allow for. Um, I can't say, but all I can say is just given how specific it is, the way that I learn the things that I learn, and then the conclusions that I draw from that would be different and take me to a different place than where I am now.
Cool. Yeah, no, I can say the engagements are much longer.
Yeah.
So you're coming out of school, you're thinking, okay, now, was there any thought process of, hey, I'm going to go work in law? You ever consider
So
that?
maybe in my first year, but I think as the curriculum went on, I realized from a career perspective, that's definitely not something that I am interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then my first summer, so the first year you can't recruit for anything on the business school side, so you have to recruit on the law school side. And so I did a summer at a corporate law firm, which is also sort of
Oh, that's cool. Tell me the difference. Corporate law versus bulge bracket investment banking. Go.
it's just night and day. The work that you do is so different. The skills that you use are different. The environments of the jobs are not the same. So for example, even as a summer, I got an office to myself. And so anytime I had a question, I'd have to walk around to the other side of the floor, peek into the office of the associate that I worked with and ask what I needed to ask. Whereas in banking, you just kind of scream across the desk and you're like, hey, I don't understand this, please explain. It's a more formal environment. It's definitely you're stuck in the office, you write your briefs. It's
Is it more
very slow
isolating? Would
paced.
you say it's more isolating? Because of
Oh,
that?
for sure. And all the work that you do is at a slower pace. And I wanted something that was very quick. I get to learn every single day. I get to learn on an open floor where people scream things, and just by osmosis, you learn.
Interesting. So you felt like it was a little bit too slow for you. You were kind of a little more isolated, kind of, I guess for people who don't enjoy that, get distracted easily, it actually might be attractive because they can kind of focus and do their work, and it's not like frenetic pace all the time. Although I think corporate lawyers can work pretty long hours, and the lifestyle can be pretty brutal from what I've heard and what I've seen.
But it's long, but it's not fast, because there are times you're on a transaction and you have to get something out in an hour, and it's nearly impossible, but you do it, and that sort of gives me a rush. And on the law side, you never have anything like that. It's like, oh, you have a lot of work, you have this amount of time to do it, you pace yourself. There just isn't that excitement from day to day.
Fair. Okay. So you're basically you do that corporate law internship. You say this is not for me, so you immediately go back to banking. Was there any other consideration in terms of other careers anything like that?
I considered consulting for a little bit, went through all of the interview prep, thought about it, and then just I think the sort of analysis that you do is not the hard, concrete technical skills that I like, and so it ended up not going down that route. But it was a very quick consideration. I may have entertained it for maybe a month and then decided it wasn't the route.
Was it the brutal case interview prep that dissuaded you from going into it?
It's a very different way of thinking, right? It's very theoretical, it's very spatial, it's very holistic. And I like that in finance, there is that like, there's like the hard, like the numbers are this is a conclusion that you can draw. Whereas with consulting, I think it's a lot more like it's a nebulous thought process, and it appealed to me a lot less.
You don't feel like there's an art to valuation in banking?
There is, right? But the art is built on the science.
True. Fair. Okay. So, so you're going through this whole process. You're kind of coming to the conclusion, okay, banking is going to be, so you start recruiting. And tell me a little bit about that process. So was it, I assume it was pretty easy. You had the pre-MBA. I mean, were they kind of drilling you? Why did you go get a JD? Were they kind of curious? I assume they also pushed a little bit on the interviews for that.
I think it's like they were 50% curious and 50% impressed. So it depended on what levers I wanted to pull, where I wanted to steer the conversation more to. So it wasn't difficult from that perspective. I thought it was also easier in that because I had more of an understanding of what the landscape was at that point, the sort of the differentiation between all the different banks, it made it more of a seamless process. So the second time around, I didn't apply to every single bank. I did the boutiques, and then I did the bulge brackets that weren't focused on the lending arm. And so it's just more of a niche process that I went through. And I think that made it more more purposeful and allowed me to know where I wanted to end up at the end.
That makes sense. So did you feel like you were able to come across more genuine in the interviews because you actually like you understood landscape better? You said, so how did you learn about that? Just through like talking with peers and understanding kind of what banks were good at different things, or how would you say?
Well, I think because during my analyst years, the work didn't interest me that much. I spent a lot of the time trying to meet people in the different groups, sort of understand how the bank is structured as a whole, right? So not only the products and the industries that my bank had, but also what banking book is, what trading book is, what the market risk team does. And so that gives you like a basic understanding of how one bank works. And then when you talk to people from other banks, it sort of builds upon what you already know. And because of that, you're able to like draw a diagram in your head, like, okay, this is what I like about this bank. This is what they do and what they don't do well. This is a team that actually does the models. And so once you parse that out, I think it becomes an easy choice of where you want to end up the second time around.
And so tell me, what about Goldman specifically attracted you? Besides the incredible name, obviously, and brand of Goldman, was it the way the structure was set up specifically?
So there are a couple things. I love that the M&A was embedded in the industry group. So once a deal came in, the technical work didn't get outsourced to another team. Two, I like that they're generally strong across the board. So you get to work on a lot of products as an associate. And that was also true in my experience in my 2 years. I worked on restructuring, I worked on IPOs, I worked on follow-ons, bond issuances, M&A from buy side, sell side, and then from buy side, both from a strategic and sponsor perspective, and just being able to see the wide range of things out there. And then thirdly, I was very impressed by their recruiting process, how seamlessly it was done, how they have a team and everyone has a job and how everyone executes. It's very on point. They don't miss any appointments. They know as much about you as you know about them. And that was an indication to me that, okay, like it's not just all brand name. There's the substance that warrants the brand name. And that's somewhere where I want to work.
Got it. So you were impressed with how they presented themselves, and that left a good impression, but you also loved the fact that you were getting to touch a lot of different things. They were strong across a lot of different products. And more importantly, there wasn't the technical piece wasn't outsourced to like an M&A team. So great. So do you feel like your years there, did it live up to kind of your expectations, or was there any surprises, things you enjoyed more, things you enjoyed less about it? I mean, it
Yes.
was different because you were an associate, right? So it's a little bit more stressful because you're managing and still delivering work product, right?
Yeah, no, that's you. I think you hit the nail on its head. I think I had an incredible 2 years there. I worked a lot, didn't sleep at all, but definitely worth all the time. I got to work on products across the board. I got to understand. So I've always been in sort of the TMT world, and so I was able to drill down and understand the different spaces within TMT.
Hmm.
Um, and then from a managerial standpoint, because I was an associate, this is the first time that I had to work with someone below me. So I think a lot of my first year was understanding how to both manage up and down.
Hmm.
Yeah, so
That's hard. That's really hard,
yeah,
right?
no, it's so like that caught me off guard because I was like, as an analyst, I did everything. I was super responsible, and then having to learn it from the associate standpoint and sort of understand if they don't do this, where are they coming from and why, and how do I fix it. And I ended up, I thought it was super rewarding. I ended my 2 years and walked away with the analysts, like having great relationships with them. And that's something that I really enjoy.
That's impressive. I think a lot of associates, well, I think you had the advantage of having done banking before. I think where a lot of associates struggle are the ones that come in maybe from consulting or corporate finance or corp dev, corp strategy, get the MBA, then go do banking. You kind of knew the ropes at least a little bit in terms of had the speed, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So you were ready. So that helped you kind of probably gain some respect in the analyst size. Um, okay, so you're working really hard. You're working long hours, but you're enjoying it. When did private equity kind of come into the picture? Was it a recruiter that reached out? Was it a mentor that said, hey, you should really look into this thing? Because I know it's again almost impossible to do the transition you did. It's incredibly rare. I know there's a ton of people at I think at Wharton, 50% of the classes in the private equity and venture capital group,
Yeah.
and only about 10 to 20% of them have actual private equity experience. So you're competing against a pool of people who already have that experience. So how did you go about the recruiting, and how did it even come about?
So it sort of goes back to why I left my analyst role and then why I started my associate role, and the fact that at Goldman, you get to see everything across the board. And so once you see everything across the board, you know what you like. And so the thing that I enjoyed most was M&A. And I worked on M&A from the sell side perspective, from the buy side perspective for both sponsors and strategics.
Mhm.
And then I realized I like the buy side more. I like it particularly for the strategics that need more of the advisory capacity that a bank has to offer them. And so my thought process is, if I like this the most, why don't I do it as a full-time role?
So explain that, like, what do you mean the advisory process? Like you like the buy side M&A where you were coming in as a bank and giving more like specific advice in terms of like what targets to go after?
You're like, once they're in negotiation with the target, you're thinking about the valuation, you're helping
Got it.
them with the diligence. Whereas if you're working for a sponsor, they already know what they want to do, right? They're just
Mhm.
using a bank to sort of find the targets and then the capital. And so I just found that work the most stimulating. And like, I thought I would love to. I was the most stimulated. I think it's very thoughtful. And again, it goes so you get to understand the companies and the operations. There's always a why, but behind the numbers. And then only in this role can you dig into what the whys are. And so my thought was, if you enjoyed this so much, then just do it as a full-time job.
Okay, so you enjoy it so much to do it as a full-time job. There's a big leap there because it's still very hard to break in.
Yeah, yeah,
So tell
exactly.
me what people said to you. Tell me what kind of your first steps were.
So I reached out to all of the recruiters across the board. And when I say all, I really mean all. I reached out to all friends who have gone through the process, everyone they spoke to, large and small firms with specific focuses. And
Mhm.
I think that's probably the first part. With recruiters, they're sort of a gatekeeper to what the jobs actually are. And sometimes I would argue it's harder to impress them than it is to impress an actual interviewer.
Mhm.
Um, And then I've also done the sporadic, like you meet your friends and the colleagues through them and they put you in touch, but that's a harder step to take because usually people will have a conversation with you, but if there's no headcount on their team to bring anyone on, then like the conversation is educational, but it's sort of not helpful for your transition process.
So like you were doing some networking and like through friends, but you weren't like aggressively hitting up LinkedIn and trying to talk to associates at funds, or were you doing that stuff too?
I did that as well, but again, I think the sort of ad hoc thing is like a, a lot of them told me, "Look, you're impressive. We'd love to have you, or at least give you an interview." But we've hired all the associates that we need, like 18 months ago. So there's no more room for an additional associate on the team. So I mean, it was helpful in that they'll tell me what their day-to-day is like, and I understand more about the role, which I can use for the interviews. But in terms of actually trying to like transition that or like convert that into an offer, it wasn't that helpful.
So what was the break?
I just stayed in touch with the recruiters. Actually, I think some of them believed in my story. And so it was fortunate that a couple of them did give me a couple of opportunities. But it was a really hard process. I did have one recruiter tell me, "Look, if you don't know what you want to do by the time you're 18, it's too late." And I was just like, okay, I mean, I guess I didn't know, and I guess it's late. And then even the interviews were very difficult. I think I bifurcate that into two stages. The first couple of interviews were just for me to get my head around what people like to hear, sort of like get in the flow of what the behaviorals are, and then understanding what they're looking for in the case studies. And then once I got through the first, I want to say 3 or 4, then I really began to hit my stride and understand what they want, what I should say, what helps me stand out, and then convert that into an offer.
I want to dig into that a little bit more. So it sounds like you had it sounds like 3 or 4 processes that the recruiters did help you get into because they were buying your story of, I enjoy the M&A process, I want to be on the buy side, blah, blah, blah. So they actually gave you the shot. Now, were these for pre-MBA associate roles? How did you kind of market yourself?
So I said I was totally open to pre-MBA associate roles. I think if you're a post-MBA associate trying to make that transition, that's the only thing you can do.
So you were open to a big pay cut.
Yeah, exactly. And taking a couple of years back. I mean, I think when like you're trying to make that hard of transition, you just don't get to choose.
Yeah, you have to just be willing to. But I think the hard part is even saying you're willing to take the pay cut. I bet you a lot of the recruiters were like, yeah, right. Okay, whatever. Like none of the buy side firms are going to want to look at you because you're just so non-traditional, because like they don't want to bring somebody in who's been managing people and then all of a sudden you have to do all the models and all the due diligence work. And right.
Yep.
I guess that's the biggest hurdle to climb, is convincing people that you really are open to it.
Yep, exactly. And then at the time, I actually really meant it. But then also having been in this role again, in retrospect, I really appreciate that I was able to start as a senior associate.
Okay, well, that's good. So you're kind of going through this. You said the first few times it was really tough to know really what they wanted to hear. So you had like case interviews. Were they asking a lot about the deals you'd worked on, I assume, and drilling down on those?
I think that part isn't that hard. It's the cases, because in banking, you're not taught to think about things that deeply, and you don't know what questions that can come up. So you're preparing to the best you can with the knowledge set that you have, but you're not anticipating the Q&A that will come at you. And it will take you a couple of times to get that under your belt, to like understand what you did wrong the first time, and when you need to address the second time, and sort of like build that holistic framework. And I think that came to me after about the third or the fourth opportunity.
And was this like cases that they just had on site?
Yeah, like you'll have to build a model on site, and then there'll be an MD who sits down with you and asks why you make that assumption or why you make that, and did you consider that, and did you consider this? And I think it's like, unless you've been in a buy side role, in a sell side capacity, you probably think about that to like maybe 40% of what a buy side role needs. So I was only able to offer that and had to like really step it up for the interviews.
what do you think? Like, was it something along the lines of like considering returns? Like, can you be more specific about what like level? So like the first level, you like could do an LBO model, you get to an IRR and multiple invested capital, you spit out the answer, and then and then they kind of are drilling down more specifically on like the strategic fundamentals of an industry. What was the surprising part, I guess, in the first
Yeah.
few? Do you remember?
Uh, it definitely wasn't the numbers, right? Because like the numbers are very like rote, and once you do a couple and you understand how an LBO is built, you have everything down pat. It
Mhm.
was more so like thinking about, okay, the industry that the company is in, what are the pros, what are the cons, what is the competitive advantage with the customers, with the suppliers, like what is sort of like the strength of the company? Is it stable? Is it something that ramps up very quickly? Would you put an earnout if you were to buy this firm? And then I think previously I had thought about it as like, okay, this is what I liked about a company, and then this is what I didn't like, and this is what I dig more into. Whereas once I've done a couple of them, I realized I had to bifurcate it into like the pros and cons of each of the categories I had to go through. And then I also had to consider things like, okay, what is the process like? Is this something that a lot of people would bid for? And then sort of having a very cursory understanding of the different profiles of the funds out there, who would be your competitors in trying to buy the asset as well, to be able to give a case study that really stood out.
That's interesting. That's great. So, I guess in terms of anything else before we call it, so you obviously made the transition successfully. You started kind of hitting your stride. Is there anything else, looking back, you would have done differently? Like, do you regret doing the JD at all? Or are you like happy you went through that academic exercise, as you said, scholastic?
No, I think I've loved every part of my career. One thing I would say is I had a really hard time. One of the most interesting experiences I had is I interviewed for this firm, and at the Super Day, one of the partners, he saw that I had my engagement ring on, and then he had asked me, okay, so when do you plan on having kids? And I was just astounded. I didn't know what to
Oh,
say. It was just like
that's
it
crazy.
was just yeah, it was like you're gonna get questions like that, and even
Right.
if you don't, it's on people's minds, so this is something that you have to take into consideration. And one of my and I think after that interview I ended up with the offer, decided to decline it, and I think at that point I went through a lot of doubt of like, should I pursue this at all? If this is on everyone's minds, I'm never going to get the opportunity. And then I talked to my mentor at work. I talked to one of the recruiters who eventually became a mentor, and they were just saying, if you can get through all the case studies and get to the end where they give you an offer, then like you're pretty much set from a skill set perspective. It's just if you meet the right if the right opportunity comes along. And so if that's the case, then you should just keep on trying until you
So
hit the one firm that believes in you.
if that partner had not made that comment, which is incredibly inappropriate, would you have taken that offer?
I mean, there was also a lot of considerations because it was across the country, and
Got
then
it.
and the pay cut was large, and I would be starting as a junior associate. But I think it was that comment that put it over the edge. And it was not so much that he made it, but it's like he made it out loud, so it must be on everyone's minds. And so if
Mhm.
it is, will I be able to make the transition at other firms?
Yeah, and I think the recruiter that ended up being your mentor is right. If you can get one offer, you can get others. And so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
exactly.
that actually, especially now that the recruiter knows you got an offer, you can be sure that he or she is going to put you in front of any other
Others.
similar opportunities, right? So you
Yeah,
just proved yourself as a candidate. So I think, well, kudos to you for turning it down after all that
yeah.
work, and then you kept going. So how long after you turned that down did you end up with the offer that you ended up?
I must have turned it down around April, and then got an offer around the end of July. So it was a good three months.
Yes, it wasn't immediate right after.
Yeah, it
So, well, good for you.
was
That's
a hard
incredible.
time.
So tell me a little bit about, so anything else before we call it, like any recommendations you'd give to other younger listeners out there that are either want to follow in your footsteps, or advice you'd give to your younger self?
It would just be on that last point. I mean, there's a practical thought that you have to constantly evaluate yourself. Are you competitive enough to make the transition? And so there's a constant like, how do you rank your class? Do people think of you as a technical associate? And so like that's sort of the reality that sets in. But at the same time, you do have to have that drive. You do have to have that like, I know the whole world is against me, but I'm just gonna like go through the motions, take the interview, do a good job on it, and see where it goes. And I've never been in a point in my life where I really needed to have that faith, and I think it was the first time. And so for a post MBA associate, if you're looking to make the transition, you really have to believe in yourself, as corny as that sounds.
No, it's true. I mean, if you don't believe it, forget it. You're done.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to believe in yourself. No one else is going to fight for you. So,
Yeah.
well, Louis Bulge, or however you say your username, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. Until next time.